Hey, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Excuse me. Good to see y'all. Hope you are well and enjoying your semester. Um, okay, so before we get trucking with Lau and Castaneda, want to make sure that people got back their response papers. If you did not, then you can message me about that. I you know didn't just I just sent them all, so hopefully you got them. If you didn't, let me know. um, and also just open the floor for any sort of administrative or other questions, just to check in for the semester. Everybody doing okay, feeling good about where we're going as a law school, and more specifically in this course. We good? Okay. um, all right, so let's do it. So so today we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about tracking. And we're going to talk about tracking in the context of language, where, which was present in the Lau case and also in the Castaneda case. We're going to talk about tracking in the context of ability and potentially disability, which we see in the Berkelman case. But before we do it, I just want to just sort of make sure we're on the same page with the language that I'm using when I say tracking. And sometimes you would use ability grouping as the way that you might define tracking. Basically, all I'm talking about is an education policy that separates students out based on some sort of evaluation. So obviously, we've talked a lot about segregation and separation in the context of identity, racial segregation, um, sex-based segregation or classifications. We've also talked a little bit, though not as much yet, about segregation based on not identity, but based on residence. So geographic separation across school districts, or across neighborhoods within a single school district. And so in all of those contexts, there's been some sort of really non-educational related um, characteristic that is being used to separate out students from one another, right? Either you live here or you live here, and based on that, you're going to be sent to different schools, or race or sex. Those being characteristics that obviously aren't completely unrelated to someone's education, but really aren't education related characteristics. When we're doing ability grouping or tracking, the idea is that there is some sort of education related or performance related characteristic that is going to be utilized to separate students out. And it's driven from the idea of difference consciousness, that we should be conscious of the different needs of different students, and therefore separate students out based on those different needs. So, the perhaps earliest examples that you see of tracking in school would be like the high, medium, and low reading group in elementary school or even kindergarten classrooms. So we evaluate students and we say, okay, these students don't even know their letters, and so we're going to have them separated into this group and focus on learning their letters. But this group over here is already putting small words together, and so we're going to push that group further in in reading. And so that's the motivation, and that's the form it takes. And it can take a lot of different forms. Excuse me. A lot of different forms. It can take the form of what I've just described, like a within classroom kind of tracking, where students who share a classroom are separated into different groups. It might be different classes within a single school. So there's um, you know, uh, AP English and Honors English and Standard English or something like that at the high school level. And it might take the form of different, so entire different tracks. So that's different classes within a school. It could be entire different tracks within a school, or it could be entire different schools within a district, as we sort of see in the Lowell High School example in San Francisco, where there's a specific high school. There's one, the Lowell High School is academically advanced, but they also talk about a high school for vocational students. And they talk about, I can't remember the other, there's 4 special high schools within the district at that particular time. And so it can take a lot of different forms, but what we have in common in all of these cases is some sort of allegedly education-related characteristic being utilized to separate students in order to treat them differently, in order to, give them presumably what they either desire for themselves or what the education system has determined is the best way to serve those particular students. Okay, and so that's ability grouping in like the most neutral way that I can describe it. What we're going to sort of encounter is some of the problems, maybe policy problems, but maybe also legal problems with ability grouping. And we're going to, try to balance that tension between this instinct to treat students the way they need to be treated in order to best serve them, and these dangers that might exist with regard to ability grouping and tracking. Okay, so to begin with, I just want to very, very briefly put up one of the quotes from the Lau case, right? We had these difficult questions that we saw from Lau, and we're not going to talk about this one really in the Lau context, except just to identify that what they're talking about. So we don't have a lot of guidance from Lau. If you recall, this is the case where the Chinese-speaking students were not getting any services whatsoever, and the court is saying you have to do something, right? That's the charge from the Lau court, is you can't just do nothing to rectify language deficiencies. There is some sort of statutory obligation for school districts to do something. And they recognize that what a temptation is going to be here is to create a specialized program for students who don't speak English and separate them out from the other students. Okay, and so they recognize that that's going to be a temptation because that's the way to do this. If you have groups that speak Chinese and don't speak English, then and your obligation is to get them up to speed on English, well, then it doesn't do English-speaking students a service to have them in the English language learning portion of what these other students are being provided. And so they say here in the case, with this in mind, that ability grouping or tracking is likely to follow from their order to do something. They give this warning, right? Any ability grouping or tracking system employed by the school system to deal with the special language skill needs of national origin minority group children, then here's the key part, must be designed to meet such language skill needs as soon as possible and must not operate as an educational dead end or permanent track, okay? So they're worried, you can see here, that tracking could be used as a permanent separation of students in this context based on language ability. And they're also concerned that if it doesn't sort of quickly turn into like a merged track, then there's a possibility that not only will that separation be permanent, but also the ultimate education that is provided to these language minority students will be a dead end, right? That's the language that they're using there, okay? And so these are sort of going to be on our mind as we turn to Castaneda and then ultimately also to Berkelman as we talk about tracking and the possibility of an educational dead end being a result of a tracking program. So what we have in Castaneda is sort of the next layer after Lau. If Lau, the charge was do something, In Castaneda, we have a school district that has done something to rectify language abilities. And the question is what they have done sufficient in order to satisfy their obligations, their legal obligations? And so I've been alluding to and suggesting, and now I'll just say it explicitly. If Lao is about an acceptance of the idea that school districts do have an obligation, in other words, that there is some sort of right for language minority students to have some action taken to serve them, that Lao is step one. Castaneda is step two. What does a court do once that is there, right? Does the court have any leeway to evaluate, once a school district has done something, whether or not what they have done is good enough? Okay. And so if there is a right to an education or a certain aspect of an education, then the next question is going to be, do courts have the ability to go behind school districts, to go behind teachers and principals and say, no, actually what you're doing is not legally sufficient to satisfy the obligations to make these rights real? Okay, and so that's what Castaneda is about. And so in Castaneda, they have this separate program for students who are native Spanish speakers, and they are separated out. And there's kind of two challenges in this context. One is the sort of details of the bilingual education program, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, because that's really answering that question that I just posed, which is, can courts go behind school districts and evaluate what they're doing? And Castaneda kind of provides us a framework for that. But before they get there, they're talking about this tracking system that's being employed, and the charge that what is in play here is a unconstitutional or illegal tracking program, where there are students being labeled high, medium, and low as ability, and then given different curriculum, etc., when in reality what's being mapped onto that is a student's language ability to speak English, right? So if you are unable to speak English, then you're ending up in the low ability group, regardless of how brilliant you might be in understanding literature or math or other skills. You're in low exclusively because your English is not fluent yet. So I guess I want to ask of the group here, what are the dangers that the Lao court is talking about, that the plaintiffs in Castaneda are suing about, to these tracking systems? What are we worried about? What, and the court identifies a few things that we're worried about. Why are we worried about those things? And then ultimately, as we move forward, we're going to start to identify how a court can deal with them. So what is a concern of in particular, let's focus here, because in Lao and Castaneda, this is what we have, a language-based tracking system. Yeah, Kiarika, I see your hand.
One thing that they talk about is, yes, they work on them being proficient in English, but there are other stuff they need, like mathematics, social studies, and stuff lack. And so going on down the road, you're always further behind people in your class because you didn't learn what you were supposed to learn in math in second grade. So now when you get to third grade, you're behind.
Great. So an over-focus on language to the exclusion of the other topics is a danger with long-term effects. Jordan, what do you think?
I was going to say that the court also had mentioned here that the actual, the labeling of high, medium, low was created a sense of inferiority, when really the inferiority was in their English proficiency, not in their educational abilities. So that was something that the court pointed out.
And I think there's two separate things there. One is that the labeling might be mislabeling, right? If we're having a tracking system, and the tracking system is going to have the effects that Kiarka has described, then we better darn well get it right when we identify people in the different tracks. So one, the labeling has to be accurate or correct. Second, that there is, and this sort of reflects or echoes Brown a little bit, that there's some sort of psychological impact involved in separating students based on this. You know, you might call them group, group lion, group cheetah, and group leopard, but everybody knows the students know that it's a high reading group, a medium reading group, and a low reading group. No matter how they're labeled, students are, able to understand that, and there is a psychological effect of separating students. That may, be okay, right? It might be worth it in order to get the benefits of it, but it's important to keep in mind that that those downsides exist. Lewis, I'm going to call on you in just a second, but I want to make one other connection to what Jordan said, which is this mislabeling idea. And it always reminds me of the Plessy case, in which Plessy had one of 8, great-grandparents who was of African descent. 7 of 8 of his great-grandparents were of European descent. And so it just shows that if you have any sort of classification system, there's always these marginal, questions like who fits in what category. And in the sex-based context, certainly in the last 10 years, the identification of who counts as male and female is also sort of live topic. And so here we're seeing it, with the possibility, it's almost it reads almost as a deliberate mislabeling, right? They're saying, oh, well, they don't speak English, so we'll put them in the low group. This is this is decades ago, so maybe they're not as conscious of these kind of concerns, but it's not exclusive to education-related tracking. It's also identity-related tracking could have this same danger of mislabeling. Lewis, go ahead.
That they also talked about how the students were being taught in their other classes, mostly in Spanish, but that the assessments were still in English, so that was already putting them at a disadvantage.
Long-term educational disadvantage. Good. Takesha.
Yes, the court also talked about the kind of like, that's going back to the purpose of the LAU guidelines and how pressing English on the child was not the first goal of language remediation, and talking about how doing that is improper because it overemphasizes the development of English language skills, almost to the detriment of the child's overall cognitive development.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good. So, we're seeing that there are long-term effects to the potential tracking involved here. What else? Think of maybe in Berkelman. What are they worried about this tracking? In Berkelman, the concern was not just that Lowell High School existed, although there is a hint that there were some people that said you can't have this at all. You can't have a specialty high school that is aiming at academic excellence, or pushing certain students in advanced academic ways. But what are they really worried about in the Berkelman case, in the San Francisco schools? Yeah, Lewis, go ahead.
Was it the demographics were disproportionate to the actual student population?
Yeah, so we've got a concern in Berkelman that there is, they're using an educational measure, but it's having an effect that looks like our old identity-based separation, or not exactly like that, but it sort of has a connection to our identity-based separations. And Lewis, is that also present in Castaneda?
Oh, you mean in terms of how the different classifications were?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it was the same. That I mean, even though yeah, I guess the school districts in Castaneda were very high percentage of Spanish speaking
Mm-hmm.
students, and I think that it was disproportionately those students in the lower classifications.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's driving the plaintiffs in Castaneda is that what they're doing is separating based on ethnicity or language ability allegedly or ability allegedly. But what they're really doing is separating out Spanish speaking students from the other students. And Lewis, if I could stick with you, if they said we're going to create a separate schools. If they said we're going to create separate schools for our students of Mexican descent, would that be constitutional?
I don't think so. No.
I don't think so either. What if they said, okay, within our school, all of our students of Mexican descent are going to be in these classes and all the other students will be in these other classes? Could they do that?
No, they can't do that.
No. So the suggestion here is that they're doing something through tracking that they certainly couldn't do directly or explicitly. Okay. And so if we scratch a little bit at that disproportionality, what are we worried about? What are we worried about? I mean, is it problematic in and of itself, or is it problematic because we might be worried about some other thing? Takesha, I think your hand is a leftover hand raise. Is that right? Or do you want to talk?
Yes, that was a leftover hand, but I think that I don't know. Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
The question is, we've identified that another concern maybe with tracking is a disproportionate representation in the various tracks. So in Berkelman, we had an overrepresentation or a significant underrepresentation of Black and Latino students in Lowell High School. And in Castaneda, we had a huge overrepresentation of students of Mexican descent in the low ability groups. And so my question is that a problem in and of itself, or is that a problem because it kind of makes us worried about other things, that might be evidence of some other thing that we don't like?
I mean, I think that it's problematic in and of itself, but it also raises concerns about other things, just discrimination as a whole, and going back to making sure that all the students are getting the same type of education. If we are in these schools and communities where there are disproportionate numbers, then it starts to raise a concern about how are they being treated differently, and then how this impacts them overall. So I know it has a lot of other impacts, even though it appears on the face to be helping students by separating them in this way.
Including, as someone said earlier, the psychological impacts, on everyone involved here. Chelsea, I see your hand.
Yeah, I think that Takesha kind of said it, but I was just saying, like basically to make sure that it's not, it doesn't turn into like a discriminatory, or that it's genuinely motivated by the educational concerns and not discriminatory motives. And so they're not using it to kind of either hide or have it turn into a discrimination motive.
Yeah. So motive is what I'm driving towards. Like we would say, okay, ability grouping is okay. On page 2 in Castaneda, they talk about this. The second column, the right-hand column, they say, as a general rule, school systems are free to employ ability grouping, even when such a policy has a segregative effect. So long, of course, as such a practice is genuinely motivated by educational concerns and not discriminatory motives. So the more disproportionate the makeup of the groups of the tracks is, the more we start to worry, like, like, is what they're doing actually just pretextual for identity-based segregation or identity-based tracking, which Lewis has said would not be okay, right? You couldn't just say, okay, Mexican descent students, you go to that school. You couldn't do that. But now we have like a correlation between Mexican descent students and language that allows for this kind of separation. And as Takesha said, that looks like maybe there's educational motive for it. And in fact, there probably are pedagogical advantages to from a language standpoint to doing this. Yet, there's a and Castaneda talks about this. There's certain districts that they have kind of a bad history on these questions, and so we kind of need to dig a little further and say, okay, well, are the motivations really educational and not sort of an overlay of an educational motivation on top of what we actually are seeing, which is discriminatory motive. Okay, so you guys have identified a lot of dangers. Does anybody want to come to the rescue of ability grouping? So these are things that maybe we should keep our eyes open about, but are they so much that we should say no more ability grouping, treat everybody the same, it's too dangerous, the impact on students is too great, there might be mislabeling, it might be having a permanent impact on the student's educational future. We don't trust it. We think it might be pretextual for racial or ethnic or other discrimination. Does anybody want to come to the rescue of ability grouping here? Yeah, Takesha?
Okay, so one of the things that they talked about in Castaneda was about, I guess, the role of teaching English in schools and how it's not solely the responsibility of schools to teach students English and that they should learn some of it at home. But if you think about families that don't have anyone else at home except for the student that's being taught how to speak English, I mean, they can't really get that at home, and most times they may be teaching their families that. So I don't think that it's appropriate to just say that the ability grouping is wholly or should be dismantled altogether, because there are some benefits to that for the students who don't have access to learning English at all.
Good. I see Caitlin Dagan and then Caitlin Jackson.
So I thought the Berkelman court made a good practical point that was like, the budgets make it kind of impossible to offer every program at every school. So sometimes it might make sense in order to provide the best opportunities for all students across the district to create some type of system like this.
Yeah, and I actually think I've been thinking about that particular point a lot lately, because I think that the last however many months we've been doing online classes has made me wonder, like, is that really true that we can't offer every class at every school? Do we need to rethink whether or not that kind of physical barrier, which I think certainly at the time of Berkelman was, they were making the point that we can't have everybody go to the same school. You really can't at this point. If there's a AP course in one school, but it's not generally offered in the other school, there's really no reason why a student at a different school could not be enrolled in that AP course, for example. Caitlin Jackson.
This is kind of anecdotal, but when I was in the classroom, I co-taught with someone else, and we had our students grouped in high, medium, low, and we only taught math. But what we did is we had 3 separate stations within the classroom where my co-teacher would teach a group of students at the same time that I would teach a group of students. And then we had kids on computers, like doing supplemental learning. And so we did 3 rotations with the idea that the lower students would get the content twice rather than just one time and get additional time to practice. So I just think that that's just kind of another practical reason that it wasn't necessarily they were getting the same exact information. They just got more opportunity for guided practice and more opportunity to spend time with the content.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned you were doing math. Was the tracking in math the only kind of tracking that happened in that classroom?
We were content specific, so I only
Okay.
taught math. That we did some reading intervention stuff, but I didn't do the tracking for that. So
Yeah. The reason I'm asking is because a lot of times you'll see tracking set up in a flexible way that, rather than a permanent whole, 100% track, what you'll see is students grouped into different tracks for math and different tracks for reading and different tracks for art and different tracks for whatever, so that there's not, even though each subject matter has tracking, it's not a universal, like, this is the low group, this is the medium group, this is the high group. And so it's a lot more specifically tailored in that kind of environment.
So that makes more sense. Our groups changed every quarter. We re-evaluated and retested, and so kids were very fluid between the three groups.
Good, and that's to correct for any potential mislabeling that's happened, right? So you have a constant reevaluation. Darius, yes.
Yeah, I was thinking about your question. The way I took it, you're asking like the pros of like ability grouping, basically.
Yep.
And I guess like when I pulled two from the Berkelman case, it pointed out like some students may prefer, or may be beneficial for students who excel to actually be in the opportunity where they can continue to learn too, since there's not something kind of pulling away from them, having to cover stuff they already know, I guess. And then alternatively, like the other groups, it mentioned the vocational path and everything, but I guess I would just think like just from a practical matter, just some students may actually feel more comfortable being around students that they feel like they can kind of move forth with as a group. Like if you're in a group and you feel like you're kind of behind or whatever, you may feel like, you're not in the, I guess, in the ring or whatever. But with the group that you're more comfortable with or around, you guys can kind of move ahead, I guess, at the same time. So that's an argument.
Yeah. It's might even be, there's a psychological impact of not tracking, right? Potentially of being stuck in a group with people who you even think are kind of way beyond where you think you are. Rose, I'm going to call on you, but before I do, and while you speak, I'm going to launch this poll. How many of us have experience in our lives as students in tracked environments? My guess is most. So A is yes, B is no. Do you have experience in a tracked environment as a student? Rose, you can go ahead while people are answering.
I was just gonna kind of add to what Caitlin was speaking to. Like in my classroom, if I'm honest, there wasn't a time where I couldn't use tracking because everything surrounded data. And so it wasn't necessarily that I was always using a high, medium, low, but if I taught all contents, but if I was teaching math and we had a short quiz, I would go back and look at that. The kids who didn't get it, I would pull in to small group, so it was never like it had to be fluid because it is very easy for kids to see, feel inferior in schools in general, but also if you are someone who's teaching where kids are already at a deficit, you have to have some type of way to view things so that you can push them along and provide them with what they need. So I think Takesha mentioned it. It's not necessarily like, I don't think you can get rid of it because you need to be able to support kids on their level.
You want to be in a world where every kid has equal situation at home and equal talent and ability and equal opportunity to succeed, but we don't live in that world. I think this to your point, Rose, you have to be attentive to these different needs. Am I understanding that correct?
Right. And teachers have to look at the actual data for what it is to best support students.
Yeah. Here's what y'all said. See, so most have experience in learning in tracked classrooms. Heather, I see your hand up. Are you there?
sorry. I also agree with Rose. I don't have the practical experience. She obviously does as a teacher, but one point I'd like to make is I think everybody goes through standardized testing of placement in middle school for high school. I mean, that's why we took standardized tests at the end of 8th grade to see where we should go to honors English or regular English or whatnot. And while that's not kind of like the language-based tracking at issue in the cases, it's kind of, I mean, standardized testing is like required if I'm not incorrect. So even though the court here, like I'm just confused because even though the court like basically says like, you know, something has to be done about all of like this language-based tracking stuff, they do that anyway. And also they have secondary language classes. And I know a few people who English is their second language and they learned in middle school or high school. And they also took classes like history and math at the same time they were taking secondary English classes. And they had really, I mean, and like I said, this is just my experience, but they really had no issue, which I don't understand how that's possible, but yeah, no, I think tracking is really difficult not to do just because like my example before, like standardized testing and placing me into, like I went into honors English my freshman year and then I took regular English my sophomore year because I just didn't want to do honors English anymore. And it was a different type of class, like completely. And I had to go into honors English again junior year because they were learning what I had already learned in freshman year.
Yeah.
Right. So I think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Haley. I see your hand.
So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry. I had a question about with the English, with it being an English second language, if you were to be learning that and you're taking the classes at the same time, how are you really getting an effective education if the class is totally being taught in English is what I'm struggling to have, or what I'm having an issue with.
Yeah, I mean, this is related to, I think, one of the very first points that was made, which is that no matter what you do, almost, if you have a language deficit, then there's going to be some sort of effect, right? So one way in which that's handled is what you're describing, which is an immersion type program, which is, you know, teaching English in a lot of ways through immersion, which means that in your, you know, social studies or health or math class, you're also being taught in English, which means that you're having to do a translation, probably if you're not fluent in English, in order to even understand what's going on in the math class, for example. And so the concern, Haley, if I'm understanding correctly, is that you will not be getting as far or as fast in math as if you were taking math in whatever your native language is. Is that one concern?
Well, the thing is, like, I took Spanish for 7 years, and I mean, I'm nowhere near fluent in it, but I mean, I know how the immersion does tend to like make it easier to learn languages, but I'm just thinking, especially if you struggle in math, you have the one concern that it's going to be even harder if you have to translate, and then you're just going to be getting behind, and then the other thing that I would have a problem with is what if you're actually pretty good at math, it's just since you're having to translate and do all this stuff and you're being a little bit slower than others, that I feel like the tracking might have an issue with that.
Yep.
But the one thing I do think tracking is kind of beneficial as well, just because you can especially with kids, even if you're on the lower end of say a subject or a higher end, I feel like it kind of, if the kids are kind of aware of it, you can kind of, it makes you feel more comfortable to go up to somebody and be like, hey, can you help me with this? Because I feel like sometimes if the teacher's not explaining it a correct way, then maybe another person can explain it other than just the teachers. So I feel like it can be beneficial for that.
Yeah, and I think Darius made a similar point that, you know, like students might just have a different comfort level. But I want to build on the first part of what you said, which is to say, like, the alternative to immersion is often separating students out into sort of English specific classes. And the concern there is that and I think someone said it earlier, maybe it was Kierica, that you're overemphasizing teaching English to the exclusion of math. And so a student might not be able to be pushed so fast in math, even if they're excellent, because they're having to go to this English. And so, you know, these are difficult questions. And, you know, what I'm going to transition to in just a moment is, like, are they questions that a court should be answering? And if so, how, you know, what tools does a court have to evaluate these kinds of questions? Like, we could go on, you know, for a while discussing the pedagogical pros and cons of different ways of dealing with students that don't speak the majority language. But ultimately, the question is, what about courts? Can courts do that? Rachel, I saw your hand, and then Rose. Or Rachel, you're done. I see your hand is gone.
Well, my hand might have needed to be gone too, because I think I was going to speak to something else. But I think a short answer to your question is that students are, you know, the law is the support for students in education. So courts have to have some protections, but also enforcement of students getting what they need. And that's why we had things like, you know, like IDA and IDEA and all of that. So I don't know where I'm going, but that was my short.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'll just build on it. If not courts, then who, right? If there is a substantive obligation on the school district to take, let's say in this context, take appropriate action to rectify language deficiencies, or in the IDEA context to provide a free and appropriate public education to students with disabilities, which we're going to get into next week. If courts aren't going to evaluate it, then what's the point of having the right to the action to be taken, right? Like and the word that continues to pop up is appropriate action, right? The school district must take appropriate action to rectify language deficiencies. The school district must provide a free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities. And so, you know, and Rose, I guess I'll ask you, if it's not the court, then what is the enforcement mechanism for those rights to education?
So from personal experience, I would say none, because for me, as an educator, when my students weren't receiving things that they were legally entitled to, that would have to be the threat that I would report, that I would figure out how to take, you know, legal action to get things done, literally. And right. So I just don't know what would be the enforcer if the court.
Yeah, the enforcer is the goodwill of the teacher or the goodwill of the principal. You know, if you don't have the sort of law behind, then it's hard to know where the enforcement comes from. But of course, that, you know, runs you into the question that we're now turning to within Castaneda, which is, how do courts do it? You know, courts aren't not educational policymakers. They are not educators. They, you know, sort of probably judges have a disproportionately positive experience in the education system. Sort of by definition, a judge has sort of made it all the way through law school and therefore has achieved a certain level of success in the education system that is not the norm, you know? And so that, you know, the question starts to become like, how do courts do that kind of evaluation? And so let's turn to that part of Castaneda. And so what I'm looking for here is the Castaneda court sets out how you do this, or how an option. And I also want to note, Castaneda is, I think, a really interesting case, but it's not a Supreme Court case. And there isn't a Supreme Court case that does this kind of work. Castaneda is often held up as an example of what a court could do, but this is very much fluid territory that we're in. How do courts evaluate rights? And it's fluid territory because, one, courts, as you've seen, the Supreme Court in particular, is very reluctant to find a right at all. And part of the reason that they're so reluctant to find a right at all is because this second question of, if there is a right, what do you do about it, in terms of enforcement, is really, really dicey. But Castaneda is often held up as a good example of how a court could evaluate a district's pedagogical decision. So if Lau is a case that says they're not doing anything, and the court says you must do something, then the school district in Texas in Castaneda has done something, right? They have a program, they have an idea for what they're going to do in order to serve English language learning students in their district. But that very program is being challenged. So in San Francisco, in Lau, they're saying, you don't even have any idea what you're doing. You're doing nothing. Do something. And the court says, do something. And then the next question is, okay, they've done something, and the plaintiffs here are asking for essentially an order that says, do something else, right? Don't do what you're doing. It's no good. Do something different. And so in order to get that kind of order, how does a court evaluate it? So that's, there's these 3 steps that I'm looking for here. Did anybody pick up on the process through which the Castaneda court says a court could evaluate an educational policy decision that a school or school district has made? Yeah, Chelsea, go for it.
Is this where like it should be based on like sound educational theory?
Mm-hmm.
And then whether the programs and practices actually used by the system are reasonably calculated to implement effectively that educational theory that they adopted. And then it also they adopted the program to alleviate the language barriers and are making bona fide efforts to make the program work, that they analyze it, that they evaluate it to make sure it's actually overcoming the language barriers.
Good, I'm typing it in as you're saying it. So 1, a sound educational theory, like you can't just say, I don't know, you go and ask your brother-in-law and you say, hey, how do you think you'd solve this students don't speak English problem? And the brother-in-law says, I don't know, it has to be based on a sound educational theory first. But second, that doesn't work if it's not being implemented in a way that is consistent with the theory, right? So there has to be some sort of basis for the theory. There has to be implementation that's consistent with that theory. And then this 3rd step is, I think, probably the most controversial of the Castaneda process, which is to say, is it working, right? So it might be sufficient action in year 1, but after 6 years, if it's not working, then all of a sudden now it is insufficient action. So if I'm opening it up to you guys, what do y'all think about this? Does this make sense? Is there any of these 3 steps that you have a problem with, or that you wonder are courts competent to handle? Yeah, Kierica?
I actually like this process. I think with the first step with them would allow experts in the field to come in and not directly say that this has to be sound, but even if it isn't sound, it's possibly a legitimate experimental run. I feel like that's good. And then you also do need to make sure, you can tell me this is what you're going to do, but we need to make sure you're actually implementing like you're supposed to. And then of course the 3rd one is a no-brainer, because if you implement this and it doesn't prove to be effective, why would we continue to allow it? Because now it's being detrimental to the children at that point.
Good, so you like it?
Yes.
Okay, Rachel, what do you think?
Hi. So I think I don't know. I think I'm not like the biggest fan. I see where their hearts are at, but I just think it's a very broad analysis.
Okay.
And I think it's giving courts a lot of leeway, which is good to a certain extent, but in something like you said is important of we've not wanting to accidentally discriminate and give everyone a fair shot. I think it should really be, it should be a bit more stringent. And also I feel like the last one, like evaluation determining if it's working, is like the most important, because really you can't have the first two without the last one, you know?
What's the point of the first two if it's not, obviously you're disproving the educational theory, right?
Yeah,
If the theory is that this will work and it don't work, then it ain't a good theory.
It feels like something I could have written up, which is like concerning to me.
You're saying this test is something you could have written up?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there was. I just feel like there could have been a better way about it, is all.
It's just a map for how to make good policy, right? Like you have an idea that a policy might work, you implement it in a way that is consistent with that idea, and then you test it, right? Like it's like the scientific method here. That's all. You have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, and then you see, did it work or did it not work? But I think, Rachel, you're pointing out something that is absolutely true here, which is what counts as a sound educational policy. What counts as effective? You know, if it's something that is kind of showing signs of being effective, but isn't effective now, how long does it have to be, you know, how long a runway must it be given? So there is a lot of mushiness in there. Is that mushiness a bad thing? Rachel, you seem to think it is. You know, I wonder how others feel about the mushiness. Caitlin, what do you think?
I think that standards like where a court is determining whether something is effective or not, I think like taking a step back, I think that's a good thing. Like that's the only thing that we want, effective programs in schools. But those kind of qualifications put so much pressure on schools, which usually turns in the form of standardized tests and then scrutinizing teachers based on their test scores and not taking into account anything else other than a number on a page, not taking into account any holistic factors of children. So that's one thing. And another thing is effective is there's like a temporal limit to that people don't really, or courts don't seem to take into consideration, as far as courts seem to be, or maybe not, I don't know that I can speak to courts, but a lot of times effectiveness of programs is, a lot of times it's only judged after 1 or 2 years. And sometimes these new programs that we're implementing might take a very long time, you know? And one example is like Common Core education within Tennessee. Tennessee has adopted Common Core standards, most of them. But a lot of schools, like recently Shelby County has changed their math curriculum from Common Core, from a Common Core provider, because based on data, and it just hasn't been, I don't think we've taken enough time to be able to see whether or not it's effective or not. So
yeah, and I think especially the first point is you're perhaps a little bit worried about the legalization of schooling, right? And maybe we have good reason, right? What happened with Brown versus Board of Education was what was an idea that equal educational opportunity is a right that must be delivered to all on equal terms, got turned into a very simplified, what's the racial makeup of different schools? Why? Because we turned it into a legal question instead of an educational question, and that is how the courts did it. And so Caitlin is saying, and I think it's right, that if you turn schooling into a legalization question, is what you're doing legal, then it incentivizes teachers and principals to behave in different ways. Not necessarily worse, but different than, certainly than they're being trained in colleges of education or in teacher trainings. You could also say the same thing about politicization of schooling, which we're very much seeing. Common Core is a good example of that. We'll come back to later in the semester, but if you're following the news, you know, in the last, I don't know, few months, you know, even at the level of the president, there are disputes about what curriculum should or shouldn't be able to be included in, you know, for districts that receive federal funding. And that conversation is happening not based on individuals who have even read that curriculum or any of the curriculums that are involved. It is a purely political conversation, which is important. Political conversations are good. That's, you know, how, I guess maybe right now we've all had enough of them. But in general, that's how our system operates. But is schooling a, you know, should it be a political decision what curriculum is being utilized? Maybe not. Haley, sorry, you've been patient as I've rambled.
No, you're fine. I was just going to say that I kind of agree with that. This was just a simplified way of doing it, just to kind of get it out of the way, almost to just. And I was just thinking about how it seems like it's just going to be because it's so simple, it can lead to it possibly having inconsistencies among different schools, especially with the ones that are doing better on these exams. And I've never really liked or agreed with how the teachers are evaluated based on these exams, and it's just only the score itself, and we're just kind of agreeing. So it all had gotten said before I said.
Okay. For some reason in the chat right now, y'all are making good points, and they're all coming to me privately. Have I set some setting that y'all can only chat to me privately? Y'all can't chat to the full group? I have set that?
Yeah, we can't send anything. We can only send stuff to you.
Huh. Well, I'm gonna, let's see if I can do it real quick. How about that? Can y'all do it now? Okay, sorry. I don't know how that happened, but it did, and now it's fixed. Okay, so just to pick back up one point on from Haley is inconsistency, right? So the mushiness could lead to inconsistency. We could lead to inconsistency based on school districts. We could also have inconsistency among the circuits in what counts as effective. And in fact, in the context of students with disabilities, which the Mills case is kind of walking us toward, that's exactly what happened. You know, some districts, some circuits are finding certain behaviors appropriate, certain educational behavior appropriate, educational policy, and others would find that not appropriate. And so you had inconsistency and ultimately a Supreme Court decision in that area, which we will get to. So good. Just real quick, in Castaneda, they apply their test. Which of these steps does the action of the Raymondville School District fail? Yeah, Lewis.
I think it's the second one. Because
why do you think that? Yeah, go ahead.
Because I think they were saying that if you don't have teachers that are trained to teach a bilingual student, like if they don't have the necessary Spanish speaking abilities, then you can't successfully implement this like language tracking curriculum.
Yeah. So, and this is the easiest one, right? When you aren't implementing it true to the theory, then you're not doing your job, right? You're not doing what you say you are trying to do, which is take appropriate action to rectify a language deficiency. And so on this one, on the various ways based on, you know, in part based on the tracking that they're doing, you know, calling it low ability, but really it's language ability, but primarily because of the staffing. There's a clear lack of implementation that is consistent with their theory, and therefore the court sends this back. And whereas in Lau they said do something, in Castaneda they say do something different, do something else. Okay, and what we're going to start to, you know, what I want you to start asking yourself is it ever appropriate for a court to say do this, right? To come up with its own solution to this problem. We're not going to encounter it in this space, but when it comes to school funding, we're going to ask that question again, right? Do do something is an initial response. When the court says, when the school district responds and they do something, but the court doesn't like it, then the court says, do something else, right? Do something different. What you're doing is not good enough. Is there ever a point at which the school district has so failed in its behavior then that the court actually it's appropriate for the court to say, okay, I'm not leaving it to you anymore. You do this. And Lewis, I see you responding, wouldn't that be contrary to the sound educational theory? The way that this might unfold would be if the court appointed what would be known as a special master to kind of take over for the school district on this topic. And this is not unique to schools. You might see this in other types of institutional reform cases. Prison reform comes to mind as an example where, so it happens. Okay, Haley, is that a hand or is that a leftover?
Yeah, I was.
Go for it.
So I think that if they can't figure it out the first time and it's obviously not working, then why not? Nobody else can seem to come up with an idea, so maybe the courts can, somebody else that's not involved with, or I guess not necessarily involved because you want to have somebody involved in the process, but if they gather experts and do kind of the same sort of process to try it, because I feel like they're more neutral than the legislators.
Mm-hmm.
So especially if it's politicized. So I do think that it would be beneficial to do that way if they can't figure it out the first try.
Absolutely more neutral, but also absolutely more disconnected from the practical reality that a school district faces. And so therein lies the tension that that exists in this space. Okay, so I think we've gotten through Castaneda. Are there other last comments before we move in proper to Berkelman, which we've already talked about, sort of tiptoed around quite a bit. We good? So let's go. Is Berkelman a exclusion case or a relative differences case? What do y'all think? Is it like VMI or is it like Rodriguez? See a couple of relative differences here in the chat now that I've freed you to chat again. Anybody want to take a stab of making it an exclusion case? That this is VMI all over again? It's not VMI in the sense that it's excluding women, but that it is a unique opportunity that is being exclusively held to certain students and other students do not have access to it. Nobody's biting. Everybody thinks it's a relative differences case. The court talks about it as a relative differences case. That's true. Chelsea, you're brave.
Yeah, so I was going to type it, but I can't type that fast. So I guess in a way it's because the way the district is set up, where this school is like the only school that offers this, I don't want to say specialized, but like it sort of seems like they took all the honors classes and put them into one school kind of thing, is how I kind of envisioned it in my head. And so instead of, and now there's like a cutoff for like where these kids can, if once the classroom gets full, then there's no other people, like you can't come in no matter what you do. So now those kids don't have those classes that they can take at the other schools maybe. And so they don't get that, that experience or the opportunity to have that sort of higher level of high school education.
Good. So if you were the plaintiff, is that how you would frame this case?
I think it's an easy argument to make, so maybe.
Yeah, heck yeah. If you are the plaintiff, you got to say, like, this is a unique opportunity that I'm being excluded from, and therefore it's impermissible, right? It's impermissible in the same way that VMI was impermissible. Now, of course, it's not like VMI because there's not a blanket ban based on identity.
Right.
This conversation is being driven from the perspective of a student. And so I want y'all to think about this student, a student who what I think the characteristic here is you were in the top 15% of your junior high. Am I remembering that correctly? As being, yeah. So you're the top 15% in your junior high. And so I'm imagining a student who goes to a generally high achieving junior high and is in the 16th percentile. Okay. So that student will not be admitted to Lowell. And the court makes clear that, and I'm reading from the case here. Let's see. It makes clear that it does not necessarily follow that all applicants, this is on page 2 of the decision towards the bottom of the right-hand column, it does not necessarily follow that all applicants who fall below the cutoff line are educationally disqualified for Lowell's program. The cutoff is the result of space and budget limitations, not the result of a perfect determination of who can and cannot benefit from the program. So presumably this student who is at the 16th percentile can benefit from the program, can hack it at Lowell, but is being excluded. Now, so that's this conversation. The case itself is about the disproportionality racially and ethnically of the student body that is being admitted to Lowell, which is a slightly different question than the question that I'm posing to you guys right now. But if you're that 16th percent at a high achieving junior high, you're going to make the claim that Chelsea has made here, which is that but for the accident of where I went to junior high, and I suppose how I performed at that junior high, right? There is, you can't totally take out that the student did get in the 16th percentile and not the 14th percentile. But for that, then I could go to this school, and the court is even acknowledging, I think the school district is acknowledging, that it's only a matter of space and budget. That's why I'm not going, not because I can't do this. And so it makes me think of things like, oh, well, financially, we can't serve every student that could get something out of a academically advanced education. And so we have to put the cutoff somewhere. And, you know, so if someone could build on Chelsea's point, right, they're saying it's an exclusion case. And what is the basis for exclusion? Is it arbitrary or is it not arbitrary? That's the argument that one would have to make as the plaintiff here. Yeah, Haley, go for it.
So, I mean, so I'm kind of thinking along the lines of what I had to do in my federal discrimination seminar thing and fair employment practices, because I know it said that education, they're judged usually similar to the employment practices or the analysis. So could you argue that, or I guess I'm not arguing, I don't know if I'm arguing for the plaintiff, but could you argue that since it's more of an objective way of admitting these students because they are being tested along their lines of it's related to education, it's not necessarily just a generalized kind of, I guess you could make the argument if you were the plaintiff that it's so generalized, it's not specific as to what their performance will be in that school. Those kind of lines. I don't know if I'm going in the right direction or not.
Yeah, well, you're rescuing the plaintiff a little bit at the end there. Yeah. And that's really what I'm asking for. So the plaintiff is going to say it's an exclusion.
Yeah.
And that the exclusion is sensible or not sensible?
It's not sensible.
Not sensible. And so what is the basis for concluding that it is not a sensible exclusion that is happening here?
Because it has nothing to do with their ability to.
It's probably too much to say it has nothing to do, but you can say exactly what the court here says, which is that it is not a perfect determination of who can and who cannot benefit from the program. And maybe that's too much in the other direction, right? Does it need to be a perfect determination? Probably not. But what do others think? You know, is anybody sympathetic to my plaintiff here, who's being excluded based on a non-perfect determination of who can and cannot make it in this school? Yeah, go for it, Chelsea.
I mean, no, I'm saying like I am. I mean, because so for me personally, like when I was in high school, I wouldn't have made this cutoff just because my, well, I mean, I guess my high school, it would have been grade school, but like if I was looking at high school like numbers, like the one, our class size was so small, and like my class was so smart, like the top 25 people had above a 4.0. So even though I fell well within like my GPA was well within like a good GPA, technically I like my percentage would have been much higher had I gone to a different school that had a larger student body and maybe didn't take those extra weighted courses. So I mean, for me, that would say like I'm being excluded on something that I couldn't, well, I mean, I went to a private school, but if it was public, that I couldn't, I didn't have any say in because of where I lived, kind of thing. So.
And how does the court respond to this argument that I'm trying to put forth, which is that students are being excluded from Lowell High School, and therefore, and it's not perfect. You know, the court is not troubled by this as much as maybe I'm making it seem like I'm troubled. Caitlin Dagan.
Yeah, the court said that they weren't being denied a quality education, that they still had the sufficient, I guess, alternatives in those comprehensive schools. I think there were maybe 7 other schools that they could go to.
Yeah, and so they're talking about the fact that if you don't go to Lowell, you're still going to one of the typical San Francisco high schools, and you know, and they kind of, in my opinion, wish away the potential psychological impact of not going to Lowell. The way that where you go to school and whether or not you make it into Lowell becomes a part of your sort of self-identity about, you know, am I a smart kid or am I not a smart kid? But the court says there's no psychological impact of going to the same school as most other students go to. And the school district doesn't have to have Lowell, but having chosen to have Lowell, this is closely enough connected. Caitlin, do you agree that, so I'm saying, you know, that the problem is that it's not perfect, and it's not perfect. Do you think that the court is correct in saying it's close enough here to a match between the criteria they're using, junior high performance, and what they're aiming for, students who can hack it at Lowell, to make it okay?
Sorry about that. No, I think that the court is kind of not taking into account other factors at play. And I mean, I agree with this plaintiff that as the standard is applied to them, it's arbitrary. And I just have an issue with that, because I think that you're kind of like setting a lot of students on paths that will affect their futures. And if it's based on an arbitrary measure, then that's just, I think, unfair.
And tell me a little bit about that student body relative to the rest of the student body, the overall student body in San Francisco.
Oh, that it's disproportionately a certain ethnicity or race.
Yeah. And so there's that mapped onto this problem, right? So if I'm right about this plaintiff, and I don't know if I am, I don't know how close it actually needs to be, right? So I'm positing that it's that it is not a sufficiently close connection. I'm not sure that I even believe that it's not sufficiently close connection between junior high performance and whether you can hack it at Lowell. But I think there's enough to say, especially when you combine that question with the disproportionality that's involved in the Lowell student body, to, you know, make you think, like, should we do a Castaneda style analysis here? You know, what is the educational theory behind using that that measure, junior high performance, to match onto can you hack it at Lowell? Is it being implemented? Is it effective, et cetera? You know, is there enough to sort of dig a little deeper? And in fact, the court kind of is with me, right? They say on page 3 in the left column, our decision doesn't mean that we are not troubled by the underrepresentation of some racial and ethnic groups at Lowell. Uncertainty on this score, however, does not mean that the maintenance of Lowell High is itself unconstitutional, or that conditioning admission on the basis of past academic achievement is unconstitutional. And so what we're seeing is deference from the court in this case, and deference that you know, leads the sort of status quo of this particular school to continue. Okay, we'll pick up on Lowell. Ooh, it might be some time. So Friday, y'all got the message. We're not going to have class on Friday, but I want y'all to you know, get your education civil rights somehow. I think we're scheduled to have a guest lecturer on next Tuesday. So that will be a kind of break from this. So it might take a second before we get back to Berkelman and Lowell and then transition into students with disabilities, but we will get there. And I believe that your next response paper is maybe due next Friday. And, you know, this case obviously is very much within the realm of what one might speak about. Okay. All right. Hopefully you are good, and I will not see you Friday, but I will be in contact and see you next week. Okay. Adios.